All right, let's untack a really interesting moment on the world stage. The 51st G7 summit. This was June 16th and 17th, 2025, out in Kananaskis, Alberta. Beautiful spot. Usually, you think G7, you think unity, big agreements, everyone on the same page. But digging into the sources on this one, it tells a more complicated story. Quite fascinating, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
Because it really showed this complex mix, didn't it? You had these pretty significant fractures in the traditional alliances, but also you could see these new patterns, new ways of doing things kind of emerging in global diplomacy. So our mission here is really to boil down the key takeaways, help you understand not just, the headlines, but the sort of deeper meaning for global cooperation going forward. Okay,
so who was actually there? The core G7, obviously. Canada was hosting, so Prime Minister Carney. Then, let's see, President Trump for the U.S., PM Starmer from the U.K., Macron from France, Chancellor Merz, Germany, Italy's PM Meloni, Japan's PM Ishiba, and the EU leaders too, Costa and von der Leyen. That's the usual lineup, right?
That's the traditional club, exactly. But what's really notable this time, I think, is the guest list beyond that core. These invited partners, look who was there. Modi from India, Albanese, Australia, Sheinbaum from Mexico, Ramaphosa from South Africa, Lula from Brazil, Lee from South Korea, all there. And critically, President Zelensky, plus folks from the UN and World Bank. It wasn't just a bigger table, It feels like a deliberate signal. Broadening the conversation because, if the world is more multipolar now, influence is spread out, it definitely makes you wonder about where the G7 sees itself heading.
And that leads right into maybe the most striking thing about this summit. Despite all that diplomatic power gathered, there was no full joint communique issued at the end. Now, for anyone maybe not familiar, that communique, that's the big unified statement. It sums up what everyone agreed on. So not having one, it points pretty directly to some big disagreements, especially, it seems, over Ukraine and trade. It really highlights what we're calling this strained cohesion within the G7. Quite a paradox, isn't it? All that talk, but no single public voice.
It's a huge indicator, yeah. The lack of a joint communique, that's not just some procedural thing. It reflects really substantial differences, maybe even deeper sort of philosophical divides, Collective security versus national interests, that kind of thing. What does global unity even mean in today's climate? This is where it gets really interesting for anyone watching international relations.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for, the future of global alliances? We're going to dive into the key topics on the agenda. The Russia-Ukraine war, obviously. Middle East tensions, which flared up. Global trade complexities, emerging tech, diplomacy itself. We'll look at the outcomes or sometimes the lack of outcomes and really try to get into those tensions and roadblocks that define this summit. So maybe let's start with Ukraine. That seemed to cast a long shadow.
It really did. President Zelensky's presence, it was clearly a focal point. He was pushing hard for stronger, unified G7 support. But the information suggests those efforts, they ran into significant resistance, particularly, it seems, from the U.S. side. And that reluctance, it seems to be a major factor in why they couldn't issue that joint statement on the conflict. Left President Zelensky quite frustrated, as you'd expect.
And adding to that, it wasn't just a general reluctance creating issues. President Trump actually left the summit early, departed on the 16th, the first day, apparently to deal with the escalating Israel-Iran situation, which meant he missed some key bilateral meetings, including one that was scheduled with President Zelensky. So his early exit, it certainly didn't help build consensus, did it? But Canada, as the host, they did make a strong statement on their own. Prime Minister Carney announced new Canadian sanctions and a pretty hefty $4.3 billion aid package for Ukraine. So a clear commitment there from the host, even if the whole G7 couldn't get on the same page.
Right. And if you contrast that with the Middle East, it's interesting. While Ukraine showed divergence, there was a unified stance on the Israel-Iran tensions. That escalating conflict prompted a specific joint statement from the G7, urging de-escalation, reaffirming opposition to Iran getting nuclear weapons. It shows that, despite deep splits elsewhere, they can still find common ground and speak together when they see an immediate shared threat.
Okay. Which brings us to global trade. Yeah. Another area where things seem pretty tested. There was that one significant bilateral deal, right? The U.S. and U.K. reducing tariffs on cars and aerospace. That's definitely a positive step. But beyond that specific deal, broader trade progress within the G7 seemed, limited. Still quite a bit of friction, particularly involving the U.S.
That's right. Efforts towards broader agreements, say with the EU or Japan, they largely stalled out. And a big reason seems to be this lingering unease, this unpredictability around potential unilateral U.S. tariffs, especially in key strategic sectors. So this widespread trade stagnation, particularly alongside the lack of a joint Ukraine statement, it really does paint a picture of the G7's cohesion challenges. It makes you ask, how effective can a group like this be when members have such different, maybe even conflicting economic approaches?
And yet, even with these big disagreements dominating, some other crucial stuff was discussed, right?
Yeah.
Even if it didn't grab the headlines. Like emerging technology and supply chains, those were on the agenda, talking about AI, critical minerals, the whole digital transition, making supply chains more resilient, more diverse. These are huge forward-looking issues. They need international cooperation, even when things are tense geopolitically.
Oh, absolutely. And on the purely diplomatic front, there was that notable warming between Canada and India. Remember, their relationship had been under significant strain. But Prime Ministers Carney and Modi agreed to reappoint high commissioners, their top diplomats. That's a really crucial step towards rebuilding trust. It's a good example, actually, of how targeted bilateral diplomacy can still work, can make progress, even within a more fractured, bigger picture.
Okay, so if we sort of step back and try to summarize the core story of this 51st G7 summit, it feels like it was defined by pretty deep differences, yeah?
Largely driven, it seems, by U.S. unpredictability on some key global issues. But underneath that, we also saw these clear shifts happening in how global diplomacy is working.
Exactly. It feels like two main forces were really visible. On one side, you absolutely have the fractures. The lack of that communique is the big symbol. The U.S. stance on Ukraine, leading to Zelensky's frustration, even with Canada stepping up with that big aid package and sanctions. It showed the limits of that traditional G7 unity when national parties clash. Right. But then, the other side of the coin, those emerging patterns you mentioned, the clear emphasis on bringing in those outreach partners, India, Brazil, South Africa, and the others, that feels significant. Like the G7s may be evolving, trying to become a broader diplomatic club, recognizing it needs these big emerging economies at the table. And even with the trade deadlock, you still had successes like that specific U.S.-UK deal, shows progress is possible in focused areas.
And we really shouldn't overlook Canada's role in all this. The sources suggest Prime Minister Carney's leadership was pretty vital, just keeping things somewhat together, maintaining a degree of, let's call it fragile cohesion, keeping President Trump engaged on key issues despite the fractures. That couldn't have been easy.
Definitely sounds like a tough balancing act. So this really leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? For you listening to think about. If this G7 summit showed such deep ideological splits, but also this clear move towards bringing in big emerging economies, what does that actually mean for the future of global governance? Is the G7 going to properly evolve into that broader diplomatic club? Or is its traditional power just going to keep getting chipped away by internal fights and the rise of nations outside the core group? What kind of global leadership, is actually going to work best as we navigate this really complex world ahead? Something to definitely mull over.